Hello and welcome to Below the Hospital. I'm your host, Garland-Rhea Grisby Sr, Sterile Processing Manager at Sutter Health, CPMC. In this podcast, for those that don't know, I ask what some people might call hard questions, but what I think are informative questions about the sterile processing profession. Today, I have with us on the show someone who is no stranger to the industry. We have Martell Winters. Martell is a 30-year veteran of Nelson Labs, where he holds the position of Director of Scientific Competency. He participates in quite a few AAMI sterilization standards groups and is the U.S. rep to ISO for several working groups. Martell, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Garland. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just dive right in, right? Let's talk about radiation sterilization. So from a validation standpoint, how does radiation sterilization differ from steam or ETL sterilization?
Yeah, so radiation is fairly unique in the world of sterilization in that the way that you validate pretty much every other type of sterilization when you're establishing your sterilization process, you're using spores to represent to represent the microorganisms that you're trying to inactivate as part of the sterilization process. With radiation, it's actually called a bioburden-based method, where you're actually using the product's natural bioburden to determine the sterilization process. It makes it quite a bit different in that you're often concerned about the product bioburden, keeping it stable and ideally low, so that as you continue to apply the radiation dose, you can maintain using that sterilization dose that you've established.
Well, thank you for breaking that down to us. Since radiation sterilization is primarily used outside the SPD by industry, what are its use cases?
Pretty much the only use case in the hospital regarding the healthcare products is just for the single use pre-sterilized healthcare products. So you've got a significant portion, almost half of the products are sterilized using some form of radiation. Half of the single-use healthcare products, single-use sterile healthcare products. So it's widely used for those types of products. Like you said, obviously not feasible to use radiation in a hospital for sterilizing products. The space required and all the requirements would be well over what any hospital would want to try to deal with. So just have these contract radiation sterilization facilities all around the world that apply this as part of the manufacturing process for these healthcare products.
So, are there major differences associated with X-ray versus gamma sterilization, and what are their applications?
Yeah, in some ways actually in most ways there are not. There really isn't much of a difference between X-ray and gamma, and there's a third one called electron beam. And gamma for many years was almost the primary method for sterilizing healthcare products. But there's been quite a resurgence in the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so of popularity with the machine generated sources of radiations of electron beam and X-ray. So the main difference is that gamma, it uses radioactive substances, it uses cobalt-60 to provide the radiation for sterilizing products. So the cobalt started off as cobalt-59. It's placed in a nuclear reactor for a year and a half to 2 years, and it absorbs a neutron and becomes cobalt-60, which is a gamma emitter. So it uses photons to sterilize. Both X-ray and electron beam are machine-generated sources. So plug it in, it works. You unplug it, it doesn't work. There are differences, though, in capabilities between gamma and X-ray and E-beam. You asked specifically about X-ray. There's a lot of popularity of X-ray because electron beam, it being an electron instead of a photon, it actually has mass, which means it does not penetrate through material quite as far as gamma can. Which means that usually you have a thinner profile or a less dense product going through an electron beam sterilizer. Now, X-ray is also a photon-based sterilization process, so it's just like gamma, which means the penetration is essentially equivalent to gamma. The makeup, the setup of the irradiator, the design of the irradiator is often different, but essentially the benefit to X-ray along with gamma, or as an alternative to gamma, is it can be unplugged. You can unplug it and it's not radioactive. It does have very good penetration, like gamma. In fact, many X-ray sterilization facilities are irradiating in a pallet format similar to ethylene oxide. So the sterilization facility does not have to unpalletize product and then put it back on the pallet as part of sterilizing. The disadvantage to X-ray is it requires a lot of energy, somewhere between 6 and 12%, depending on the irradiator, of the energy you put in comes out as X-ray photons, which means it takes a lot of energy, and by far most of the energy you put into an X-ray piece of X-ray equipment goes off actually as heat. So you lose that as heat, which is not beneficial to the sterilization process, the way we're setting it up. So electron beam does not have that conversion issue of converting energy to electrons, but it does have the issue of not having as good a penetration. Good. When it comes down to it, I'm convinced, and as I talk to other experts in the industry, I think we all agree, in most cases, you could use radiation or ethylene oxide. And you notice I use a general term radiation instead of defaulting to gamma. Gamma, X-ray, E-beam, generally they're about the same as far as impact to product with any damage that might be occurring to the product. So when it comes to radiation versus ethylene oxide, which is the other significant, about half or a little more than half of single-use healthcare products are sterilized with ethylene oxide. And it turns out in most cases, you could use EO versus some form of radiation. What tends to be the biggest driver of why you choose one over the other, it's more things like what's closest to me, or what am I most familiar with, or where are the rest of my products going. That tends to be the bigger driver. Now, every sterilization modality has some disadvantages or some weaknesses. So the bigger weakness for radiation is it does alter polymers. That means that you need to understand, of all the polymers that you have going into your healthcare product, you need to understand which of them are gamma stable or radiation stable. Now, there are a few materials that are quite well known to be problematic with radiation sterilization. A good friend of mine in the industry, he's been retired for many years, but this friend of mine has mentioned that the way he remembers is that there are a few polymers that are apt to fail APT. So acetals, polypropylene, and Teflon. And it's not that those can't be used. Some people say, well, if you have Teflon, then radiation's obviously out, which is actually not the case. In my early years of working in the lab and working with manufacturers doing their radiation dose establishments and dose audits, there was a cautery handpiece, and the tip of that had Teflon on it, but it was impregnated in an adhesive, an epoxy adhesive that kept the Teflon together. So you got the benefits of the Teflon, but it was protected by the epoxy. So, but anytime you use those three, acetals, polypropylene, or Teflon, you have to be careful. You have to keep the radiation dose low. You have to understand if the grade that you're using, is it appropriate? And are you keeping good control over the product bioburden so you don't have to increase your radiation dose? Things like metals, for example, have no issues with radiation. Their molecular structure is such that there is no impact for any form of radiation. It's more the polymers you have to worry about.
Thank you for breaking that down, especially cobalt 60, because I was going to ask you what that was. I was going to ask you how to break that down. So thank you for doing that. So now let's talk about the products. Now, what products or materials are best suited for radiation sterilization?
Yeah, because radiation sterilization is has the different approach to sterilization we talked about at the beginning, where it's a bioburden based method as opposed to steam or ethylene oxide. When it comes to change control, you have to think about it differently. For radiation, that the main concern is product bioburden. Does it change? Does this change that you're assessing, does it have the potential to alter the product bioburden numbers? So how high is the product bioburden on the product bioburden types? All forms of sterilization are a function of both bioburden numbers and bioburden types. There are always, in all forms of sterilization, there are some types of microorganisms that are more resistant than others. So the most resistant types for the other forms of sterilization are always some type of spore former. Like in radiation, the most resistant types of microorganisms are not those that can form a spore. They're actually those that can repair their DNA. So there's actually greater concern when it comes to radiation sterilization with regards to change control and the ability that change has to alter the types of your product bioburden. Both the numbers and types are important, but since radiation is bioburden based, it means we don't have near the amount of overkill that you have in an EO or a steam process. So that means that we have to be really careful with changing bioburden numbers and types. And the resistant bugs in radiation tend to be pink in color on an agar plate. So there's something about there's some connection. We don't quite know what it is, but there's some connection apparently between the pink color and the fact that they're highly resistant to radiation. And they're not spores, like I said, they're gram-positive rods and gram-positive cocci. So that's what it boils down to. Change control has less to do with the other aspects like configuration, and there are times where that can be an issue, or slight changes in density. You do have to deal with those in a different way regarding the application of radiation dose. But the biggest concern is what's the product bioburden, and is this change likely to alter the numbers or types?
Thank you, because that was a lot to unpack. So let's talk about the FDA, right? How do FDA expectations around radiation sterilization differ from those of other global regulators?
In the big picture, there's not a significant difference. We're fortunate with most forms of sterilization. They're the ones that we use quite regularly. Ethylene oxide, steam, radiation, that we have ISO methods, ISO standards that everyone follows pretty similarly. So as far as the core processes, the core concepts in radiation sterilization, we tend to not see a big difference in how the various regulators are looking for compliance. There is something that we do, one small aspect of that we see more frequently coming from global regulators compared to FDA, and that's this a concern regarding overestimation of bioburden. And the overestimation means in many cases, since bioburden is the main driver for radiation process, uh, manufacturers tend to be very careful with respect to their product bioburden. In fact, in many cases, they're so careful that the bioburden tends to be zero or very low. In a bioburden test, the way you perform that test, there is always there's always what we call a limit of detection of that test. And the LOD, the limit of detection, is not unique to radiation, but in radiation sterilization, when you have a bunch of zeros, then your product bioburden is less than 2, less than 3, less than 5, whatever it is, depending on how you perform your test. We are seeing greater concern from global regulators regarding how much sensitivity you have in your bioburden test. If you're kind of lazy, you don't want to test a lot of, you want to make the bioburden test easier, you might have a limit of detection that's quite high. For example, 10. I guess I should, the limit of detection is low, but the factor is high. So if you're only testing 1/10 of the product or 1/10 of the solution that you perform the extraction in for bioburden, it results in a test that's not very sensitive. And so global regulators generally, we're seeing some concern there that they want the bioburden test to be as sensitive as possible. And there are several reasons behind that that we won't get into for the interest of time. But we are helping to address that. And I haven't mentioned this yet. The ISO standards for radiation are under review right now. So we just last year, 2025, we finished a significant revision of 11137-1, and we're in the thick right now of a revision of part 2 of the radiation standard 11137-2. And in both part 1 and in part 2, we're adding content to help provide the industry with the science behind limits of detection in bioburden tests, sensitivity in bioburden tests, how you can improve the sensitivity, or how you can deal with sensitivity if for some reason it's just not possible to get a more optimized bioburden test.
So thank you for bringing that up, because that's just going to segue right into this next question, right? So what emerging technologies or methods do you think will shape the future of radiation sterilization?
You know, if you'd asked that question about 10 years ago, that everyone was saying, well, X-rays becoming the new sexy thing with sterilization. Because there was some concern for a period of time that since I explained briefly the manufacturing process for cobalt 60, so it's about 2 years in that overall process, and obviously you can't just decide, hey, uh, we need to install more radiation next week or next month. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to so the manufacturers, Nordion is a sister company to Nelson Laboratories and the Solterra Health family. They have to be very careful at forecasting, working with their customers to understand what they should forecast. And part of that forecasting is it relates to Nordion or other manufacturers also providing some of the cobalt. So, like cobalt 60. There was a time where some of the other manufacturers either shut down or were not able to provide cobalt to the industry as a whole. And so Nordion was left almost by themselves to provide the cobalt, which meant the overall availability of cobalt was lower. And some people said, well, the sky's falling. We're not going to have cobalt's going away. We don't have cobalt anymore. Cobalt 60, which never was true. But it was true that the amount of cobalt that had been forecasted by the industry was not available. So there was a shortage for a few years. So X-ray was a good alternative there. Like I said, it has the penetration, but it's a machine source. So you can make more of them, you can unplug it, etc. And I think there's still some good future for X-ray. When it comes down to it, though, if you look at it from a green perspective, from a sustainability perspective, gamma is actually the better of the three methods between gamma, X-ray, and E-beam. So, but that's kind of comparing the types of radiation. If you look at big picture, what we think will shape the future, the benefit to radiation is that it's really easy to determine a sterilization dose. As long as you have a reasonable bioburden, you have reasonable control over the product bioburden, it's actually very simple. It's quite easy to establish a radiation sterilization dose. The problem is, since it's so really you got just a few steps. You perform a bioburden test, you get your verification dose from a table, you apply that dose, you perform a sterility test. If the results come out correct, then you're done. You have your radiation dose established. The problem in some ways is we've made it too easy. It's just a cookbook, very simple steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're done. what has resulted there is that for the last couple of decades, most manufacturers don't really understand the science of radiation, and they don't understand the product bioburden. So in the last few years, the what we've been trying to focus on in standards and in trainings is it's really important to understand the product bioburden, get your not just get your bioburden counts in a table and file that away, but to also get the types of microorganisms and to really understand the numbers and types, to trend those numbers and types of microorganisms so that you understand that your radiation process is functioning correctly, and you have an early warning system if you're keeping track of those of your product bioburden, so that you know that things are going to continue to go well.
Nice. Well, thank you for breaking that down. Well, thank you, Martell, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. We know you're super busy, super swamped, um, especially given all of the information that you've given us here in this brief time that we talked. We just want to thank you for giving us your time today. So, folks, as usual, I hope this episode has been useful. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can find us at Below the Hospital on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and Amy.org. Until then, see you when I see you.